Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're going to be going over the Stafford Gambit. Derives from the Petrov Defense, which is e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6. Now, after knight takes on e5, the most common reply from black is to play d6, and then after the knight comes back, then knight's going to capture here on e4, and play continues. But in the Stafford Gambit, black says, yeah, I don't mind that you took this material right here. I'm going to play knight to c6. For this particular video, we are going to be going over the accepted line, and that is if the knight takes here on c6 and black recaptures here on c6. This is the most common variation that you will see. I will do another video that goes over the decline line if they choose to do something besides knight taking here on c6. Now, there's a few options that we're going to be looking at today as far as how white may continue. Since the knight is attacking this pawn here on e4, the most common response that I see is e5. This is attacking the knight and getting the knight or the pawn out of harm's way. Other moves that you could see are d3, solidifying this pawn chain, opening up for the dark square bishop to get involved into the game, and just all in all protects this pawn in the center of the board. And lastly, you could see knight to c3. Pretty common development move, defends this pawn here on e4 as well. So those are the three variations that we're going to be going over in the Stafford Gambit. So the first move is e5, and that's going to force the knight to come up to e4. Black really needs to be aggressive in this game, giving up that pawn. This knight here is attacking the king side from white. Also opens up for both of the bishops to get involved into the game. And this queen has a semi-open file, as well as can easily come to queen to h4, put a lot of pressure on the king side from white. Now, white has a few options here. The first one would be to completely ignore this knight, which is easier said than done in a chess game, and that is to play d4. This is the best move from white. Control the center of the board and just let this knight hang out here on e4. If they do this, I recommend playing queen to h4. This puts a lot of pressure on their opponent, and many players are going to make a mistake here because this is threatening queen to f2 checkmate. And a lot of players, when they see this, they play something like g3 to stop that, but this actually opens up the door for a trap, and that is the knight coming here to g3, because if the pawn takes, then the rook is going to fall, and if the pawn takes here, then queen to e4 check, and after the king moves, or the bishop or the queen, let's say queen to e2, then the queen can come up and take here on h1, and white's side is just completely decimated. Black should have a pretty easy game here. Now, if we come back and say, what if the pawn doesn't come to g3? What if something like e3 instead? This protects the pawn here on f2. Well, now I recommend f6. And this is important because black is going to be looking to blow up the center of the board, then get the light square bishop involved into the game. Many times it's going to come to g4 and then castle on the queen side and throw everything they can at the king side of the board. Now, white may be looking to kick this knight away. It can't come to f3 because this pawn's pinned down by the queen. But if you see something like bishop to d3, then black can play bishop to g4. This is attacking the queen, and remember, the pawn can't come to f3, which it would like to. So the bishop may have to come back to e2. These are just getting moves from white, just going back and forth. And so while black is down a pawn in material, it does look like he's going to be able to get some of the momentum back in the game just from having an active board state, taking material in the center, and then castling on the queen side of the board. So that's what happens if at the very beginning your opponent pushes forward here with d4. The next line you may see from white is to play d3, and it looks logical, looks to kick this knight away and opens up for the dark square bishop here. But after bishop to c5, black is in a really bad spot. They can't just take this knight here on e4 because bishop to f2 is pretty deadly. You can see this is check. If the king takes, then the queen is going to fall right here. If the king does not take, maybe it comes to e2, doesn't have any other options, then bishop to g4. Now the only legal move from white is to take here on f2, and then the queen is going to fall. So we can already see that it's not going to work if the pawn takes the knight here on e4, but then how else does it stop this pawn being attacked here on f2? The only real option is for this bishop to come to e3, but that's not going to work as well. Bishop takes on e3, And then after the pawn takes here, then queen to h4 check. And things are pretty bad from here. Now, if we look at it and say queen to e2, well, that's just going to be checkmate with bishop to g4. That's not going to work too well. If they try that g3 move, well, now, same thing as before. Knight takes on g3. If they take with their pawn, then the queen can just swing up here to h1. That's not going to be good for white at all. If they look at this and say the rook's under attack, so maybe I'm going to bring my rook here to g1. Well, now the knight can just come back here to e4. This is a discovered attack with the queen on the king here. But there's also no good moves from here. If it comes to e2, well, this is just going to be checkmate here on f2 from the queen. If instead the rook comes to g2, well, now the queen can come up to h2. This is threatening taking here on g3. We still have the bishop can get involved into the game. There's just no good moves that white has here. Definitely going to lose a ton of material. So that's what happens if they play d3 early on, although it looks like it's going to be kicking that knight away very early. It's not going to do that because bishop to c5 is just deadly. The next line you may see after knight to e4 is knight c3. This is attacking the knight and just says, hey, if you want to take material here, white's up upon a material, this should be fine. That's not what black's looking to do here. Instead, queen can come to h4. Now, the slight difference is after the pawn comes to g3, you can't just take here on g3 because if they were to take with their pawn on g3, you can't come to e4 check and fork the rook here because the knight's just going to take here on e4. So we don't have that option. But if you see g3, at this point I would just recommend taking on c3. If from here they decide, okay, well, if I take your queen, then you're just going to take my queen, but I have a king side that kind of looks really messed up here. If you kind of look at this, they may not look like this setup for white. So they may decide, well, I'll just go ahead and take with the pawn here on c3. Well, in this case, they took your knights, but now the queen's going to come over to e4. So this is what we were doing before, and at the end of the day, this rook is going to fall. So that's going to be extremely good for us. If they do decide correctly and decide, let's go ahead and take the queen here on the h file, now the knight can take here on h1, or d1, excuse me, after the king takes. Now bishop to c5. You can see this pawn here on f2 is under attack. There's two pawns on the h file. It's going to be very difficult to hold on to those as well. The bishop can get involved here to g4. Although black is down a pawn in material, does have a lot of targets and should easily get that back in the game. So this is not a bad spot if you do see that they play g3 and then take your queen right here. Now if we come back after queen comes to h4, they could also play d3. This is going to be a huge mistake. Hopefully you can just see queen takes on f2. That's going to be checkmate. That's probably the worst option. But another thing that you could see is how do they defend this pawn here on f2? One option would be to play queen to f3. And if they do this, you have a couple options. One is if you just want to take here on c3, you have that option. The other option would be to keep material and just play knight to c5. Yes, you are still down a pawn in material. You have a very active board state. You want to start getting your other pieces involved into the game. Castle on the queen side is my recommendation. But this is the other alternative if you see the queen come to f3. So that's all that you're going to see if your opponent plays this e5 at the beginning of the game. The next variation is d3, and you'll see this a lot because players, when they see a new opening like the Stafford Gambit, they're up in material and they just want to hold that advantage as much as possible. So this opens up the door for the dark square bishop to get involved into the game. It protects this pawn here on e4. It seems pretty safe, but black can get active pretty quickly with bishop to c5. Now, how does white respond here? They have to realize that there's a strong threat that's going to be happening with knight to g4 with the threat here on f2. But if they don't look at that, if they play something like knight to c3, then knight to g4 is pretty brutal. There's just no way to really defend this square here on f3. If they try something like bishop to e3, then the knight can take here. If the pawn takes, then bishop takes here on e3. And you can see white's standpoint, the king side of the board's pretty much blown up here. Black has that pawn back in material, and they still have a very active board state. So this is going to be good from Black's standpoint. Now, if instead they don't play knight to c3, if they recognize that the knight can come up here to g4, and so maybe they play bishop down here to g5. This is pinning down the knight, so the knight can't move here, but that should not stop Black. Instead, they should get pretty active and take material here on e4. This also attacks this bishop here on g5. So that's an important note, but it's also threatening this pawn here on f2. So a lot of threats that Black has here, but you can see that they are giving up material here on d8. But this would be a huge mistake. It would actually be a mate threat, because if the bishop takes here on d8, then all of a sudden, then Black can spring into action. The bishop can take here on f2. There's no legal moves except for the king to come to e2, and then bishop to g4, and this is going to be checkmate. Pretty cool checkmate if you ask me. Now, if they look at that and say it's going to be a bad move if I take the queen here on d8, maybe they just play bishop to e3. This does stop the immediate threat here coming to f2. In this case, go ahead and take with your bishop here. After they take with their pawn, then you could play queen to h4 here. And this puts a lot of pressure on them. They are under check right now. And there's not a lot of good moves. If they play king to e2, this is going to be checkmate right here. If instead they play g3, then same thing as we've seen in the other variations. Knight can take here on g3. This is threatening the knight here, or the rook here on h1. As soon as the knight moves, it's going to be a discovered attack on the king. So this is also not going to be very good from white. Now, if we come back, instead of bringing the bishop back here, maybe they decide to take with their pawn. Well, this has the same challenges as before. The bishop can come here to f2, check. If they take it, the queen's going to take here on d1. And if they don't, if they play bishop here to e2, then bishop to g4, check again. Pretty much only have to come to f2, and that's going to leave their queen to fall here on d1. All in all, this is just really, really bad for white. So again, early on, if they play, as we talked about, that d3 and the bishop comes here to c5, it's going to be a very, very good game from Black. Now, the last option is, instead of d3 we're going to be covering, is if you see knight to c3. This does immediately defend this pawn here on e4. Now, Black should still be looking to do the exact same thing, and that is bishop to c5. Now, in this case, you can see the main difference from white's perspective. When they has the knight here on f3, they can always push things like d4. But because that knight's not here on f3, they gave it up early on. Can't do that anymore. Bishop to d4, and the queen is protecting it on d8. So they're not going to be pushing forward with their pawn here. But instead, you could see bishop to e2. Preparing to castle on the king side of the board. In this case, queen to d2. This does threaten the queen coming here to f2 checkmate. So they're pretty much forced to play castle on the king side. And once they do that, you can just take with your knight here on e4. You got that material back, so both sides are equal in material, but Black still has a pretty aggressive board state. So this is going to be fine for Black. If instead they bring their bishop a little more active, instead of bishop to e2, maybe it comes to c4. Well, slight difference, instead of bringing your queen here to d4, I recommend playing knight to g4. And this is still threatening the same thing. But the main difference is, if they were to castle on the king side, now the queen can come to h4, and this puts a lot of pressure on white's standpoint, more than if the bishop was back here, where, you know, the bishop could have taken here on g4. Now that the bishop's not on e2, it can't threaten the knight, so Black just has a lot more variation that can go down. If the pawn comes to h3, well, this is not going to be good. Knight takes on f2. If the rook captures here, well, then you could just see the queen takes on f2, maybe king to h1, and you can see not a good setup for white. Black has a pretty aggressive board state. can get his light square bishop involved into the game, castle on the queen side, start to push all their pawns toward the king side of the board. This is going to be very, very good for black. Now, if we come back and say, yeah, I don't have to take right here. The queen's under attack, so maybe the queen comes to f3. Well, now the knight can come back to h3, and this is double check. The knight's attacking the king as well as the bishop. When the king's attacked in two different ways, the king has to move. There's no other variation. If it comes to h1 here, then you could see knight to f2, doubled attack again. Only option is come to g1. And then you see the queen come up here to h1, and this is another checkmate. So you can see there's so many different traps that white can fall into in the Stafford Gambit. And even if they play perfectly, black can maneuver around and still have a pretty good game. Now, if white plays flawlessly with any gambit, if you're giving up material, there is a way that the other side can overcome that. But I like to play gambits where you give up a little bit of material early on, but you have so many fighting chances, and if they haven't seen it, it's very, very difficult for them to play perfectly. So check this out, especially if you play the Petrov Defense as black. Most of the time, they're going to accept that early on. They're going to be taking the pawn here on e5. I don't see very many players that are playing this opening, then seeing f6 and doing anything except taking here on e5. So you're going to have lots of different options to play this knight to c6. So check it out. Let me know what you guys think about the Stafford Gambit. Again, I'll be doing another video on the decline line if they choose not to take here on c6, but most of the time you will see that. Thank you guys so much for watching the video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.